Welcome to Spellcraft Novel Media, where stories are treated like spells and every conversation becomes a ritual of creation. Our guest today is David Beaumier, author of the recently published anthology, The Mourning Fields. The Mourning Fields interweaves myth and modern story, giving classical figures new life in the 21st century. The stories explore the often related nature of love and pain, power dynamics within relationships, and the complexity of trauma. As written in the book's introduction, for those who confuse obsession and control with love and who thought unyielding persistence meant loyal devotion, the ancient Greeks said those souls went to the mourning fields, a place where they could spend eternity confronting their choices. David is also the recipient of the Village Books Literary Citizenship Award and the Marketing and Communications Manager at Chanticleer Book Reviews and Media. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah. It's a pleasure.
So, David, what does storytelling mean to you? Is it a form of escape, a revelation, a rebellion, or something else entirely?
I think for me, the closest on that list is escape, but for me, I love storytelling as a form of reflection, as a way for us to sort of understand who we are, where we sit in relation to the stories that we read and the stories we tell. And they're a way of understanding ourselves, and our history, who we are, where we show up to be, and how we show up in those spaces. And so I love this question. Just yeah, it's a delight um to see such a thoughtful thing. It's very exciting.
I think that your answer, that it's a reflection, really fits with the Mourning Fields as well, because that is not just like a reflection about love and about trauma and about relationships, but it also feels, reading the different stories and the different perspectives, as if like a refraction of, you're seeing, even if you're looking through one character's eyes, one character is the narrator, it feels like you're seeing so many different sides of a scenario at the same time. So I think, yeah, reflection is a great way to describe that.
Yeah, thank you.
So, editing and writing are similar yet distinct skills that not everyone can do equally well. What is your approach when you look at a piece of fiction as an editor? And does that approach differ based on whether it's your own work or someone else's?
hmm Um, I think I would love to say that I approach my own work with the exact same kindness and empathy that I approach other people's work. But of course, with my own work, I tend to be much more critical, much more, oh my gosh, what's going on here? And then it can be harder to see it. I'm very fortunate to have been able to work as a freelance editor. I still take on editing gigs from time to time, everything from developmental editing all the way down to proofreading, and formatting internally books. And for myself, I often think, I think there's a saying of like, there are no great writers, only great editors. And for me, that really appeals a lot to me, my sense of my fiction, what I write, because a lot of the time, the initial drafts are not always great. I know some people churn out these incredible first drafts that are just completely mind blowing. But for myself, I really see myself as an editor, who has written something and then takes the time to put it together and polish it. When it
Yeah.
comes to, do you want me to talk a little bit more about
No,
editing
please go ahead.
processes
Yeah.
generally? Yeah, I was like,
Yeah, no, it was just, I was thinking before I, as a reader, before I started to get into the book community and make friends with authors and editors, I really thought that authors just, it just came out perfectly. And I was thinking to myself, I could never, I could never write anything like that. I question everything, it's so
Mhm.
imperfect, but then learning actually how much goes into the process, that you don't have to, it doesn't have to be perfect right from the start.
Yeah, I think for me, whether you're writing or you're editing, one of the key things is to know where you are and what you are currently doing. And so sometimes when you're writing, you get to a point and you're like, I don't know what happens next. And you stare at that blinking cursor and you cry a little bit and you just wish that the idea would come out. And the issue is you're writing when you're supposed to be brainstorming.
Oh,
In my mind,
interesting.
you've picked the wrong thing. And so likewise with editing, I try really hard not to proofread when I'm doing a developmental edit. And so a lot of times these days when I approach fiction, I'm often have Jessica Brody's Save the Cat writes a novel sitting in the back of my head saying, where is the inciting incident? The one I love, one of the ones I love the most is the false victory or false defeat in the midpoint of stories. I think we've probably many of us have heard the term soggy middle before, and that often is sort of indicative of there was no moment where you thought the protagonist won or you thought the protagonist lost, and then you could change the direction of the storytelling. I'm a big sucker for a lot of different writing craft books. And so I sort of have like someone's voice where I imagine my head sitting on my shoulder whenever I engage in, okay, I've gone past this developmental part. It's time to get into line editing. Let's get, Matt Bell refused to be done on my shoulder, and we'll talk about that. And, we might go back to someone else like Jane Allison's Meander Spiral Explode and explore what happens there instead. So many wonderful, wonderful people who have written books and shared their knowledge.
That's so cool. And I love hearing all of these different approaches to the story and to the editing process.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking about processes, dancing is a big part of your background, and I would love to know, how does your background as a dancer inform your writing process or your editing process?
I think for me, dancing sort of comes out more when I'm editing other people's work in a lot of ways. For me, when you dance with someone, it's taking a moment and helping them feel the absolute best they can in that moment. And I've been doing Argentine tango for 20 years, believe it or not. And I teach it every Wednesday here in Bellingham, Washington. Lots of fun. Come look me up if you're in town. Um, and for me, the important thing is that you can help someone feel loved and held during that moment. And one thing the person who I teach with has recently started saying in the last year is that she talks a lot about the stage of development that people are at. And she says, if you're doing this now, that is a normal stage of development, and we're going to work on it until we get to the next stage of development. And that for me has been really critical with editing people's work is, oh, this is, draft zero, draft one, draft two. This is a normal point of stage of development now. And then someone says, well, I'm ready to query for an agent. I say, that's not normally what happens at this stage of development. However, do what you want to do. For me, one thing that I often emphasize with any of my authors is that the work is always theirs. They always get to decide what's going to happen with it next. And if they want to query, they can query. And if that doesn't work, they can come back to me in a year and we can talk more about it. And I can always recommend someone else for them, of course.
That's beautiful. I never realized there could be so much commonality between writing and editing and dancing.
When I ran a writing group, I was like, oh, the thing is that both of these are very vulnerable activities, and you have to be able to take someone's ego and confidence in your hand very gently and say, hey, nothing you're doing here is wrong. Just because it can be improved does not mean you failed. Let's step on to the next stage together, and if we run into anything, we can back it up and we can take it easier.
That is so true. They're exercises in trust.
Deeply.
And then what inspires you to launch a new creative project?
Um, this is gonna, I think, maybe touch on things later on, but I really think it's a lot of times it's whatever sort of captures me at the moment. So if there's something that keeps cycling on in my head, and you've mentioned that a lot of these stories have a thread of trauma through them, and have a lot of themes of trauma. Traumatic things just sort of, you think of them and they replay them in your head over and over and over again. And sometimes the only way to get them out is to put them down in fiction. You can't even journal your way out of them or therapize your way out of them. You have to write it down and try to make it into something else that makes sense and have that catharsis, that purging of emotion at long last. Sort of like when someone says something to you and you're like, oh, if only I had said this in response. But with fiction, you can really take your time and say that thing and say, I got it. I made it work. Also as a chronic people pleaser, if someone says, hey, do you want to do this project with me? Well, boom, I'm inspired. Yeah, of course I want to do. You need 2 stories by May? They'll be there. Don't worry. Is there a theme? No? Okay, I've got a prompt book. I'll look at that. And then you just sort of keep going until something sticks for me anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that really impressed me, or made an impression on impressed and made an impression, was how realistic your characters feel in the Mourning Fields. They are very human, very much, you see every day in everyday life and humanity in them.
Thank you.
So, as I kind of mentioned in the intro, the Mourning Fields is an anthology of retellings of Greek mythology, but set in the 21st century and mostly in Spokane, Washington, or mostly, is it all in Washington?
I think some of them don't have a super fixed place. I think they're mostly in Bellingham technically, but there are
Oh,
some
okay.
in Spokane. One in my head is set in Orange County, California, but they're a little setting agnostic, with exception to the ones that specifically have, the Baby Bar, which is in Spokane, which 2 stories mention. There are Easter eggs for those stories, for the corresponding stories of the other stories. They have the same start time but different end times.
Oh,
And then Bellingham
yeah.
has the honeymoon.
Are there So the question that I'm eventually going to lead back to is, how
Sure,
did
yeah,
the
yeah.
idea for the Morning Fields distill? But now I want to go in a different direction, which is just to
Do it.
ask, you mentioned the Easter eggs and you mentioned how those 2 stories, yeah, have a similar start time, different end times. Are there other ways that your stories intersect with each other, or timeline wise, or beyond just theme?
Um, I sort of imagine them all taking place in the same world. I don't think that any of them, besides those two, directly reference each other. I think I pulled up my table of contents because a lot of the stories went through different chapters, and so like I have to look at, or different titles, and so I have to look at the titles and be like, okay, that one. Um, I know the White Pine explicitly mentions Beth from Just Say Yes. Like it doesn't name her, but
Yeah.
like Beth is described, and the main character like spends some time people watching her for a bit, and is like, "Gosh, I hope that's a happy young woman." Which, Beth is maybe not the happiest of young women, despite the narrator's hopes and dreams.
And
But
it
I
was
don't think. Mhm.
Oh yeah, it was just really interesting to read those 2 stories juxtaposed, because you do recognize Beth from the eyebrows and the description of the scene. Um, but yeah, again, that brings to back the idea of refraction, because you have Beth's perspective in Just Say Yes, and then you have a different perspective of the same part of the same scenario in the White Pine.
And the White Paint, of course, ends in that night. It's like a 2-3 hour story, whereas Just Say Yes is many, many days, and Beth goes off and does her thing.
Well, how did the idea for the Morning Fields distill? Because that's a very unique idea, concept.
I think I had written about 6 or 7 of these before I realized, oh, I might have a short story collection here if I wrote a few more. Um, And so that was the main thing, was that no one calls it fan fiction when you're writing about Greek myth, but it sort of is, right? It's just, oh, these
Mhm.
stories are really fun. I want to put my own take on it. Wouldn't this be cool? And so that was part of the idea. I was originally a big uh, fan of Dante's Inferno. I really enjoy the Commedia. I've read Inferno and Purgatorio a couple times. Well, Inferno the most, then Purgatorio, and I've only got through Paradiso once. And Dante is a huge Hellenic writer. He loves the Greeks. He loves everything about them, and so he puts a lot of that information in there, and that sort of naturally pivoted me over to all these Greek stories. And so as a Greek story would float up in my head, the first one was Hera. And so, I was thinking of what happens with this person who really wants their relationship to last, doesn't like that their partner keeps cheating on her. What would be a modern reason for her to I guess there doesn't need to be a modern reason to want to kill the other women in the relationship or the other men. I sort of imagined that Zeus is going around with whomever, and just
I think
having a
he
great
was.
time. I think he was. He's
Yeah.
flexible. They're Greek. It's good. And so just sort of as an idea would come up, I would think about friends of mine who are maybe in bad relationships with people who would stray, and what would they do if they could like tangibly reclaim a piece of their lover.
Hmm. Yeah. Did you realize that did you write these stories on purpose? Like, you gave the example of Hera's story. When you discovered you'd written 6 stories and were on the way towards an anthology, had you been intentionally like writing um, on these, playing off of this idea of the mythology retellings? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that came about because in the writing group I mentioned, I have a friend named Ken. He always gets a little embarrassed when I shout him out, and I at my in my acknowledgments, I think he's there. And Ken really liked the first book, the first story, Charon's Crossing, which is also fairly early. And he was just like, David, this is one of the best things you've written and submitted to the group, I think. And I had a YA retelling of the Divine Comedy that I was also running through. And I sort of imagined that Ken was like, thank goodness we have something else here. And so I would write other Greek short stories, and Ken would say, this one is good. It's not quite as good as Charon's Crossing was. And I think by the end, Siren was one of the last ones that I wrote, and it's not quite the last one in the collection. It was originally the publisher said I'd like to end on a more hopeful note. Can we swap it in the order? I said, yeah, of course, whatever you want. That sounds good. But Siren was one that Ken was like, I think you might have beat it here. And now when I talk to people, a lot of the times I say, oh, I love to say, what's your favorite and your least favorite story? Because I love to hear, the things that made them really uncomfortable and the things that they
Yeah.
really just enjoyed reading. And Charon's Crossing and Siren are the two ones that come up the most so far. Yeah.
I thought it felt very interesting to me because there are so many stories that I just felt very uncomfortable reading, but it wasn't in a way of like, I want to close the book or I can't handle this. They are written in a way that is, what the characters are experiencing is very serious, and they are processing their trauma, but it is not portrayed in a way that traumatizes your reader or is meant to make your reader suffer.
I'm really glad that I'm gonna be honest. That's one of my biggest fears. I have people say, "Oh, I'm gonna." One of my friends I just got lunch with today said, "I'm finally, it's winter break. I'm gonna get a chance to read your book." And I said, "Gosh, I hope it doesn't ruin your Christmas." Uh, I do worry about that a lot. I did have some friends recently be like, "David, no, they're really, there is a sweetness to some of the stories that's okay." And there was something else someone nice said. Someone said to me that was very kind, but they said the stories aren't sad, they're messy. And I was like, oh,
Yeah.
I'll start saying that when I try to pitch it to someone. I'll say it's. I was like, they're just about messy relationships and people doing bad things that they ought not do.
I think that's a good way to describe it. And how did you choose which myths you wanted to represent in the Mourning Fields and how you would portray them? Did the myths call to you, or did the characters from mythology draw you in? Was it kind of, I'm going to choose this myth and riff on it, or was it, I have the, more of the reverse situation?
Hmm. It's interesting. Some of them, it was the myth that drew me in. because I would think about it a lot. Last Wish is one that's, a lot of the time, one of the big pieces of feedback I get from people is to say, I really enjoyed it. I didn't recognize the myth. And I get this sense that they feel like they've made an error in some, they're like, I've failed. Didn't read your book right. I don't know what the myth was. And I really don't want people to feel like they have to recognize the myth. I want these to be standalone stories. You don't have to go pick up Ovid and be like, huh, guys, here we are. A friend gave me Ovid's Metamorphoses for Christmas several years ago. I've read one of the myths so far. It was very enjoyable, but a little dry. I'm hoping to read more in this coming year at long last. But Last Wish, for example, is I really thought a lot about the story of Bacchus and Philemon, it's not a very well known myth. They're just like this old couple who lives in the woods and they help Apollo out once upon a time. When he'd been trying to like prove that mortals were okay, and he just got kicked to the curb a whole bunch, and he was so mad. And he's like, I'm just going around as a beggar, asking for help, and no one will help me until he meets this sweet old couple. And so for them, that was it was the myth that drew me. And then I was like, what's a story that's like a modern interpretation of that? Next to it, we have Orpheus. Alzheimer's runs in my family. These are the two Alzheimer's dementia stories. And Orpheus is a lot of just my family stories.
Hmm.
My grandpa tried to put up laundry at 2 in the morning. And there was a line that I cut out about it where he would flirt with my mother sometimes, which some people were like, well, this grosses me out about this guy. And I was like, that's dementia sometimes. You don't know who
Yeah.
you're talking to. You're not sure what's happening. But I didn't want that moment where the reader feels grossed out and wants to put down the book because it's too much. So some of the stories I switched around slightly. Um, but with that one, the question, I knew that I wanted to write a story about Alzheimer's, and my godmother also suffered a lot from dementia. And sometimes I would go and visit her, and we would have these fabulously wild conversations about a woman from the circus that I had married and had 6 children with who did not exist. And then the next time I'd come back, and she would be completely lucid and with me and
Hmm.
be able to speak to me about something. And I think the scene at the end, I had heard about a similar thing happening where someone who was traveling around doing shows was having trouble remembering, but their instruction for this one particular thing they were doing was just play a solo, and that was all the instruction on their teleprompter. And they just played everything perfectly with no cues, nothing, all the lyrics they needed to teleprompter, everything in there. And I thought that image was very interesting, and so I compared it to my family experiences of dementia and Alzheimer's, and
Yeah.
thought, wouldn't it be interesting if you turn around and that lucidity is lost? And that sort of is the reimagination of Orpheus there.
Yeah, that's a fascinating approach and a personal approach. And while your stories do have a personal perspective and are written obviously by you, you embrace different voices in each story. What was it
Mhm.
like moving from one perspective to another?
Luckily, most of these were written over the course of maybe 10 years. And so, having 15 stories in 10 years gives you some time to adjust between them. A lot of times, my writing can be a little feast or famine. And so a bunch of them did come out together in some ways. Um, I think there are some times, like with Just Say Yes and The White Pine, where there's an informing of that. Those were not written near each other, but I really liked the idea of the baby bar in Spokane, which is pretty well described, I think, in The White Pine, more so than in Just Say Yes, and which was
Is it a
part of
real
the writing.
place?
Yeah, baby, it's right next to the Davenport Hotel in Spokane, Washington. It shares a space with Nito Burrito, and the chupacabra was not very good when I had it there, but the rest of their drinks are great. I don't want to,
Was
I
that
cucumber
cucumber and
bitters.
bitters?
I think it was cucumber bitters, like specifically infused bitters with cucumber flavor. It didn't work out for me. If someone else likes the chupacabra beverage in their cocktail mixer, more power to you. But
Yeah.
I really, the Baby Bar is just such an interesting place, and I grew up in Spokane, and so I've only gone there when I go to visit. And um, there are some images that I love to pull images of my friends when I come back there. And so the description of Beth was a friend of mine who I won't name just because I don't want her to get confused with Beth. She's nothing very different from Beth. But I went up to order a drink at the bar and I look over and there's this like gorgeous woman, very put together, and she just looks at me and says, "Hello, Mr. Beaumier." And I was like, who in the world is this? And I was like, oh, we went to high school together and you're a platinum blonde now instead of, like, sort of auburn hair. And I was just really surprised. It's like, oh gosh, I saw some of my brother's friends there when I would go back to visit Spokane, going through, like they just got told by their fiance that the wedding was off and just like drinking their sorrows with like strangers in the corner. And Spokane is not really like a, dark, divey, I came in and I saw this thing. And so having these experiences in sort of a surreal place where they have a lot of baby dolls just hanging around was very interesting and weird. And a lot of those pieces made it into the story, even though the experiences came from other ideas.
Well, now I love kitschy places, so now I'm very
Hmm.
interested in this place.
It has great stuff. So, it's worth a visit, I think. They've got Auntie's bookstore, they've got Riverfront Park. It's lovely.
Very cool. I will put it on my bucket list. But that kind of brings me to another question. And you talked again about the expanse of time over which you wrote these stories. What strategies did you apply, or how did you stay grounded and emotionally safe while writing these very emotionally intense scenes?
Some of them I don't feel I did. Because some of this, I like with the myth where I said, if you don't recognize the myth, don't worry about it. I often tell people, hey, don't expect me to show up in any of these stories. Like of course they're drawn from personal experience, and of course I'm the writer, but I don't murder people, which murder happens in a lot of these stories. Um, but for some of the experiences, people can conflate the author and the character, which is interesting to me. I think I think in the ways that I did try to take care of myself, I think sharing with a group was helpful at times. One of the ones that I found the most difficult was just say yes. And there are some personal connections to that story that made it more difficult for me in particular. But when I would share it with different writing groups, one of the things that makes me feel the most comforted from it, I guess is the way I would describe it, is I would have friends who are women and they would read it and they would say, I thought that this is how you found a boyfriend when I was in high school. And I was really confused. And I really like this is like Beth's story feels like my story. And it's such a mirror for me and it's so traumatic in so many ways. And I really just appreciate that you put it down without any judgment, just to be like, this is what she did and this is what happened. And it's for the reader to make their choices there. Of course, by contrast, sometimes you have a group where someone's like, the girl did what? And you're like, oh, well, if you're not familiar with that, maybe the story isn't for you. Next, let's go on. And so
Mm-hmm.
sometimes sharing it can be hurtful, of course. But I
Yeah.
think as writers, you gotta be prepared that writing is very vulnerable sometimes, and that means you get poked, and being uh, brave and going and leaning into that vulnerability can be very powerful if you're willing to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Um, and that is another great segue into the idea that every creative act carries a bit of transformation. And how has writing these stories changed you, whether emotionally, spiritually, or even physically?
Hmm.
Or has it
I
changed you?
think I think it's helped me feel more balanced within myself. I've often been the friend as I don't know if this is a common writer experience. I talk to a lot of people who say they have this, but I've often been the friend that other people come up and tell things too. If it's a big win, if it's a big loss, when, the breakup happens, when the person dies, I have people who come up and reach to me and tell me about their traumatic experience. And like I said earlier, thinking about obsession, those things that sort of rattle around in your skull and won't be quiet. I really felt um, it was before they got published, about a year before I talked to my publisher about these books. I felt like some of those voices got quieter
Mhm.
after a long time of thinking about them. And there's one story that is not in here because I wrote it, and I think it was a nice idea, and I think it was a good thought, and it just the heart wasn't there as much as in the other
Mhm.
ones. And so I was like, oh well, I didn't even edit that story. I wrote it, I looked at it, I said I'm not interested, and I was like, maybe I've moved past these particular stories. um I don't know if that means I wouldn't come back. Well, we can talk about this later, but I am coming back
Mhm.
to these particular stories in a very real way right now. But I sometimes think the person who published me is the publisher's Dark Forest Press, and they publish horror primarily. And it took me a little bit to accept that these stories might be described as soft horror. And I'm like, all right, people do die a lot in them, and they're kind of weird sometimes. I accept it. But I sometimes wonder, what does Tartarus look like? What does Elysium look like?
Mhm.
Uh, what do these other places in the Greek afterlife look like as a collection of short stories? And I don't know when that project might come up, but it's not for a little bit.
Yeah. Well, as someone whose passion is horror and has like my other personality is having a horror movie podcast, that
Yes,
I love hearing that.
that's
um,
awesome.
but what do you hope readers take away from your book?
I think catharsis is the big thing. And, I'm glad that you said that as you read through it, you maybe felt uncomfortable at times, but you moved through it. And it wasn't like I have to do this, I gotta go through, but like, let's go through, let's see what the next thing is. I really, I love the idea of looking at something that is a serious subject that we as adults have to deal with. And, as children, a lot of the times, a lot of the
Hmm.
inspiration of this came from things that happened to me and my friends when we were very young, um, which is unfortunate. And, but we take these things and we wonder, how do we get through to the other side? Hopefully we all live lives where we feel joy at the majority of our days, and contentment, and, support and love from those around us. But we all go through a lot of pain. And there's a question for
Yeah.
me of what do we get on the other side? Not of life. I don't mean this in a metaphysical way. I mean in a very literal way. How at the end of the day do we take the next step when we wake up and it's a new dawn?
Hmm. And I think in that sense, writing and reading is also an exercise in trust, just as editing and dancing, because as a reader, like, it's very intimate. You're making yourself emotionally vulnerable in this internal space, and you're trusting the author, hopefully not to, like, damage you you're
Mhm.
mentally from this, or emotionally from the experience of diving into that world.
100%. Yeah.
So, as I mentioned in your intro, you are the recipient of the Village Books Literary Citizenship Award, which is awarded to people who have demonstrated a commitment to engage with the literary community with the intent of giving as much, if not more so, than they receive. What does that philosophy mean to you, and how does it guide your own creative citizenship?
Mhm. When I received that award, which I was a little shocked by, um, I remember one of the owners of Village Books said that it was not meant as a lifetime achievement award, but as sort of a there's more to come. And I was glad to hear that because, I feel like I've got plenty of time to do more. And the first year they gave it, two of the people recipients were posthumous recipients. And one of them was someone who would occasionally mentor me, named Laurel Lee, who passed away a couple of years ago. And we'd meet up, I'd buy her a cider, and I'd say, okay, these are my questions about being a freelance editor, or okay, this is my question about this aspect of writing, and how do I run a business as myself? And early questions that I needed. And my goal has, and I'd say, do you want anything else beyond a cider? For your hour of time. And she would just say, just pass it forward, like when someone else asks you for help, show up for them. And
Mhm.
so I've made some great friends that way by just when someone says, hey, I've been very honored to that I get an email, you know, a few times a year with someone who said, I just moved to Whatcom County. I'm interested in getting into the writing scene. Everyone says that I should talk to you. And I'm like, great, let's meet up. Let's get a coffee. Let's talk about where you are, what you're writing, and who you might be a good fit with and what group you might fit in well with. Um, I think trying to provide spaces where people can connect and communicate well. I do that work with Chanticleer a lot of the time for our author groups, and I love being able to do that. And it can be a struggle for me that so many of the Chanticleer services are behind a paywall. And
Mm.
so I'm lucky that I work for a place that supports me doing other community work. And so in October, the Surrey Writers Conference, which a lot of local people go to, it's just across the border in Canada, was canceled due to a hotel strike. And they communicated well in advance. And I was lucky enough to be able to put together a mini writing conference to stand in that I did it at the library. They provided a space for free, though they did not sponsor it for government
Mhm.
reasons. They wanted me to be very clear. The library did not sponsor it, but I'm very grateful that they have free community spaces and the library is great. My work at Chanticleer paid me to, for something that they weren't getting anything for. They said, do that on the clock. We don't want, we want that to happen. That's a positive for us. Village Books donated some of their space. They offered to take some of the presenters' books on consignment and do like a special sale for them. They were really, really kind and helpful. And it just was such a delight. And I'm still having people come up and say, when's the next one? When's the next one? To which I say, okay, well, I have two more paid conferences, one in April, one in June, and then I'll think about doing another free conference that I just pulled together at the last second. But it is really wonderful I feel really privileged to be in an intersection of a lot of different people who are interested in showing up and helping people, and that I get to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that people see in your work and are inspired to follow in your footsteps. For indie and small press authors who want to give back to the community and maybe don't know where to start, can you share some examples of the resources that you have relied on? Or you talked about Laura Lee, the people you admire for their leadership in this space.
I think, like I said, Bellingham is a magical city when it comes to writing in terms of the amount of people who you can just walk in and say, I'm here to help. And people will say, great, do this. And you can just run with it. Not everywhere is built that effectively, right? But your
Mm-hmm.
local bookstores, local libraries, maybe even Barnes and Noble would be probably willing to work with someone and create a space. It could be as simple as running a book group. Um, One thing that I'm doing with a friend right now is we're meeting up regularly to do a marketing talk, and I'm just helping him with a few ideas for marketing, putting in there. And my goal is we get sort of an established balance together, and then we invite other people in.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times you can find a space that has a bigger table and get other people in there and they can listen and they can learn and you can learn from them. Even people who are very new often have great ideas and sometimes being new gives them an outside perspective. And so I think the simplest thing I can say is show up and walk in the door. That feels like 80% of the work to me, to be
Hmm.
100% honest. Is just saying, I'm here, I'm going to make this space. There is definitely a 20% extra boost. I was thinking about this with dance recently, where someone could say, I'm running a dance venue, I'm going to play music. That's pretty big. That's a huge thing. That 20% is the music good. I'm not quite sure what the implication is for writing necessarily. Maybe it's, is the advice good? Is the
Yeah.
culture good? Are you there lifting people up instead of tearing them down? And if you struggle with those things, there are great books like Brene Brown's Daring to Lead, which just came out, or Marshall B. Rosenberg's Nonviolent Communication. Those are great ways to go things. And if you're like, I don't even know where to start with craft advice, read a craft book together and then analyze it. And then you can get people together and analyze a story or analyze someone's work using that craft book. There's a lot of really magical things that, if you put in a little creativity, I think can come out and be really good. And it does take time, but I mean, I read something recently that said, if you want to have community, you must sacrifice some level of comfort because you have to show up, which is almost always uncomfortable in some way.
Yeah. That is a really good point and some really good suggestions.
And one
Yeah.
thing is to say to the wonderful authors who listen to this is, it's okay to show up with your books. I do a lot of dance events. I show up with my books. I've based after about 2 months, I stopped selling them. They don't sell anymore, but I still bring them just because it's nice to say, hey, this is the space. I try not to ever be pushy about it and say, hey, I've got this thing. It can be really nice. The other part is that I talked a little bit about doing skill shares with the marketing talk. Chances are you are an expert in something. And, libraries, bookstores, they will have spaces to give workshops. And I would really encourage people not to sell themselves and their knowledge short. I recently sat down and I really organized all the things that I feel like I can teach. And now when a conference or, local classes put out a call for, hey, does someone want to do this? I just send them, I go through and I put that list into whatever Google form or email service they want. And I say, I'd love to be there. Here are some things that I can do. And I think just the fact that I send 6+ workshop ideas tells them, wow, David's really interested in showing up for us and cares. And I am, but a lot of that work was upfront labor, not, oh, I heard this and now I'm going to jump in, but I got ready and now I can stay ready.
Hmm. Yeah. That's really good advice. And for some more really good advice, if we can ask that of you for
Of
aspiring
course.
authors or artists, yes, what would you consider the most important lesson you've learned?
I think always be kind is probably the number one thing. And I know that seems, publishing, it's a very selfish thing. I'm not trying to be like, love each other. Of course, I think that's great, but the publishing world is so small.
Hmm.
And, I help run the Chanticleer Authors Conference. I'm consulting this year on the Chuckanut Writers Conference locally. And I can tell you that when someone says, hey, I'd love to present at your conference, and there's something even a little weird out on the web of them, cussing someone out, that can be a tough thing. This is the
Yeah.
point where my partner often likes to remind me, David, say something nice, because that's the other side of this coin. Um, when I decided I wanted to put on this mini con, I I really had gone back and forth. I talked to my job first. I said, "What do you think?" And initially they said, "Well, let's talk about it. Let's figure it out." My boss is in the process of moving. Just did not have time. I reached out to Village Books. I said, "What do you think of this idea?" And they said, "Gosh, I think we don't have the bandwidth for it. This sounds like way too much work to do." I
Hmm.
reached out to Hamlet Literary Journal, which I'm an editor for, and I said, "Would you guys like to come in with me on this? Would you like to make something happen?" Um, and they said, "Gosh, I think it's going to be too much work." And so I said, "I'm not going to do the mini con. It sounds like too much work. No one. I want one person to bounce ideas off of." And I had the great fortune to get a drink with Donald Moss, who's a literary agent who spends some time here in Bellingham. He's based in New York. He has his one of his agency's books, A Tainted Cup, just won, I think, the Hugo Award.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah, Robert Jackson Bennett. But I was meeting with them, and one of my friends said, "David, were you going to do that mini con?" And he said, "I would present there for free. That sounds like a wonderful community event." And so,
Mhm.
with a little less than 3 weeks, I reached out to all these people who had said, "No, we can't do it." And I said, "I'm doing it. Here's when it's happening. Is there anything you can help? Like, can you help me with X?" I made a specific ask instead of saying this other thing, and they all showed up, like every
Mhm.
single person. And Village Books did a big lift. They emailed their entire writing newsletter group, which is over 1,000 people, to say, "Hey, we want registrants for this mini conference that's free." And I said, "Gosh, I would have never. I meant you to reach out to the writing groups. I would have never asked you to utilize your writing list that way, like that. Like I don't want you to think I assume and want to take advantage of you guys." And the answer was, "David, for you, of course we would. Why would we not?" And for me, that's the thing that I try to remember when I tell people: always treat people with respect, always be kind, don't burn bridges. It's okay to not want to work with someone, but just do it in a kind way and
Yeah.
say, "I think we're going in different places." And the rewards, I think, are immeasurable.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one thing that has been so unique about the online book community that I've experienced is just, yeah, that strength of connection and of um, relationships, and the way I think that, we live in a time that feels very isolating. It's intentionally isolating, but you having a community and, building, using that kindness to build these relationships, I think real relationships. I think so many of, like, I interact with everyone online, but these relationships are not just talking to a stranger. They're actual, um actual friendships. And I think that is so important in just making us all find that love and, like, find that community. But also, um I've really learned how much it matters just to reach out to someone, because you might not think it makes a difference if you were to tell an author, I loved your book, or it meant a lot to me. It can make their day. I really, never realized how significant that it can be when you tell someone how much you appreciate their work. Or even, um it doesn't I always think, like, the answer is always no if you don't ask. So I think if you want to ask for an advanced release copy or something like that, just ask, because the worst thing that can happen is they say no, or that doesn't happen. And maybe they've really wanted someone to read their book, or alpha read their book or something, and we're too, don't want to make themselves vulnerable. So I think being vulnerable first, and just taking the first step to make these relationships, is important. Can make a big
100%.
difference.
And on that, thank you for doing this, like this sort of community making, like reaching out to authors, asking to talk to them about their work. That is huge, and not everyone is doing that. And it's a very special thing that you're doing with Spellcraft Novel Media.
Well, thank you. It has been really rewarding encountering books that I think might otherwise not have been on my radar, or just reading outside of my usual genres. Or I don't usually read anthologies. So, and I'm still making my way through the book, but I love the Mourning Fields in a way of, it's an emotional book, but it is well worth reading. And I will absolutely be I was going to say wrecking, recommending it to
If you got to wreck it, it's
everyone.
okay. I understand. Tear it apart.
um what is next for you as a creator?
I sort of I hinted at this when I said I'm coming back to the stories, but one piece of advice that keeps coming up is for, people say, "Well, how do you sell your books?" And I know for me, the standard response is more books, right? You wanna sell your books, you should write another book. Um, and I do have one that I'm working on, but the other piece of advice I've gotten recently is dive into new mediums. And so, of course, the easiest one is probably audiobook. However, uh, Bellingham, in addition to having a thriving literary scene, also has a really lovely theater scene. And I was reminded of this recently. One of the first Greek myths that I wrote, I think before any of these, I had forgotten. I was like, oh, was that the first one? Is I wrote the story of Oedipus as a play set in kindergarten when I was like a
Oh,
freshman
wow.
in college. I got one of my best friends up on stage in diapers, telling people that he peed himself for some reason. I don't know exactly why or how that all came together, but it did. And it was a 10-minute play. And we have this lovely idiom theater that's run by two people, Glenn and Sue. And Glenn is obsessed with Greek stuff. And I've had a few people say, you should try turning these into scripts and seeing if Glenn wants to do anything with them. And so that is my current project is I'm just going bit by bit. I'm hunting down the dialogue. I'm trying to preserve anything that feels like an important stage direction. A lot gets cut, of course, because on
Hmm.
stage sometimes bits of dialogue don't make sense. Like what's this person's name and address for the Medusa story where it's an interrogation. I was just like, that's what am I gonna say? Like where am I gonna make this person? What phone number do I give? And I was like, we're just gonna cut that line into it's too weird. I don't want to deal with it. And so that's the next thing for me right now is scripts. Um, I've also been invited to work on a creative anthology project, but we're having the first meeting of that next month, so I don't even know what that will look like. And then I've got my publisher has requested two more short stories from me for different anthologies he's putting together, which will be through Dark Forest Press. Those will probably come out within the next year once I write them.
Well, it sounds like you've got your hands full. But if you do decide to uh, go into an audiobook for your book, that is also one of my favorite subjects. So I would be happy. Speaking of community connections, I would be happy to talk to you about or like share any advice I can or anything like that.
That that's for one, thinking of community, I don't know if you know Pro Audio Voices and Becky Parker Geist, but
No.
she's a delight. She's down in Portland. I met her at the Pacific Northwest Writers Association this last September. She does also interviews with authors, and so I would, feel free to reach out to her and feel free to drop my name. She is fabulous, and just we really resonate in terms of community building, supporting authors, and things of that nature. And I was just, it was a treat. She had me on her podcast. I had her do an online workshop for me. Um,
Oh, that's
I would
amazing.
highly recommend. She's working with marketing and distribution, trying to provide a alternative to Audible.
That is incredible. And you said Pro Audio Voices. Or
Mhm.
is that
They also have a software program called Amplify, and so
okay?
you'll see both probably.
Very cool. I'm definitely going to be looking into that after this interview, which I guess I will end on the question: what is a question you wish someone would ask you, whether that is lofty or mundane? What's a question you wish you would get asked during an interview, if you have one?
I feel like I love the question of what is your piece of advice because I really like to talk about being kind to others and taking care of them. That one is a high pick for me. I think one of my favorite questions. I'm just dodging it because I think you did ask my favorite question that I don't think. Um, I think the inspiration from that originally came from I would listen to Gabriela Pereira's DIY MFA back when that was running, and she always said, "What is your number one creative tip for authors?" And I was like, someday someone will ask me that. But I really liked your question about where we talked about what were the stories, um, in terms of is it escapism, is it revelation, rebellion, um, and I really appreciate the question about what do I hope readers take away from the book because catharsis is so important to me in terms
Yeah.
of how I think about writing. The opposite of catharsis, which is the Greek term for, it's usually in theater, of purging your emotion, where like you're like, oh my gosh, I need to let go of this thing. And the opposite is cathexis, the investment of emotion. And I tried really hard in these stories to think about building that cathexis and then finding that point for release and saying, let's let that go. Let's go on to the other point. And to play with not only having that happen, but also sort of changing the point where it occurs, where maybe we hit our catharsis point and then we sort of have a little epilogue in the story. Like for me, that happens in the Callan Cho story.
That is incredible. And I learned both a new word and a new concept in storytelling, and that's so cool. Well, I really want to thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us inside this circle of story. And we really appreciate you sharing your vision and your voice with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.